Hello, I'm recording this as a rehearsal, so maybe a bit rough around the edges, but I thought I would record it because then people who aren't going to be there at the meetup get to hear what the content of this is about. I'm Chris, I work for Ringier. Thank you very much, Ringier, for sponsoring the venue and the refreshments for tonight's meetup. That's really cool. The work that I do at Ringier is to be involved in different teams and different projects using the tall stack to build multi-tenant commerce applications for places in Europe and Africa, which means the things that I'm going to talk about are a lot to do with what I build day to day, and not just me, but people much smarter than me who have been doing this for a lot longer than I have. So take the info from where it comes, but obviously your application might be different or cater to a different size market, and I welcome questions about that and how you can adapt. You can ask after, you can't ask now because this is a recording, but you can ask tonight after the session. I want to take us from a place of making a completely new application. The things that I'm going to show you for making multi-tenant applications are actually pretty simple, and they all ship with Laravel. You don't need new packages to do this. There are 10 steps to doing this, and so that's the format that I'll go through with this. But I should say at the outset that sometimes making multi-tenant applications can be complex, and people who sell books and courses about it cover a lot of edge cases that you might not really have to deal with, or use a lot of packages that you might not need. So hopefully, just by the 10 steps that I go through with you in this talk, you will see you've got everything you need. It all ships with Laravel. You can start at quite a simple place, and it should deal with 95% of the kinds of multi-tenant applications you may need to build. After you've made your new app, the next step is to do some config. Now, your app needs a way to be able to tell the difference between different tenants. By definition, multi-tenant means that you've got different brands or different clients or outfits in different countries that use the same code base to market to a potentially different audience. So here we need to have some kind of config to tell the application who that audience is, what datasets to use, what visual theming to use, and we can do that via config. In one of our apps that we're busy building at the moment, we have a config that is similar to this. So it's a usual Laravel array file-based config. In this case, we have a tenant for the Netherlands, one for Greece, and one for Portugal. The format of these tends to be quite simple. So we have some kind of identifier for this, and we'll recall this value later on to do various theming things, which is why we have to define it. Not essential, but a good to have is a default indicator. So which one of these tenants should just be loaded by default. This is really useful for development environments, not necessarily production environments. And then a list of domains which this tenant should respond to. So you'll see I'm pulling a domain from config if it's necessary. I'm pulling the production domain as an example, a staging domain, and then just a local herd or valet domain for testing. Similar setup with Greece and Portugal. So the slug, kind of important. The list of domains, kind of important. Default, not so much, but useful for development, so maybe keep it in there. That's the first thing. We need to establish a config so that when we hit one of these domains in our app, the app can say, this looks like the Dutch tenant, and I can show stuff in there related to that. Be that language, be that theming, be that the database that it uses and pulls data from. The next thing we need to do is to resolve a tenant. So this is just a fancy word for matching those domains to the particular set of config and databases and that kind of thing that need to be loaded for that tenant. So how do we do that? Well, there's a couple big ways that we need to resolve for applications. Laravel applications tend to target HTTP, and they also target some command line stuff for when you make custom commands that you need to run. Well, maybe you need to run that command just for a single tenant. So I'll show you how to do both. this is the HTTP side of things. We have this request helper. I'm a huge fan of helpers, and you'll see all the forms I have here. All these functions are the helper forms and not the facade form. But anyway, I'm getting the request and the host from that. So that's just the domain name part. It's not the schema. It's not the path after it, just the domain name part. Then I get the tenants from config, which is that tenants config file that we saw earlier. And then for each of the tenants, if the domain is this domain that we're pulling from the request. Now, I like to use string is because it lets us do asterisk wildcards in the domain names, which is pretty useful. But you could just do a straight string comparison here if you wanted to. That would probably be quicker. Okay, then I've got that tenants data, which will be an associative array by default, which I'm passing through another little helper method to convert it to an object in a recursive form with some other little helpers in. Not really going to go into that. This is just converting the tenant array into an object. So if I find that tenant with a matching domain, I return that. And because this is a return, it breaks out the loop. And so this is just an early exit. But then if I don't find any of the tenants based on domain, I'll get the default tenant. So this is where that default parameter kicks in. Really useful for dev. Okay, now say we want to resolve this on the CLI. How do we do that? Well, you may have seen this env helper from Laravel in the config files. Basically, anything in the environment, any environment variable, can be resolved with this env helper. So we can pull tenant from that, do a similar comparison, only now instead of using the domain, we can match the slug, because we can be very specific if it's on the command line. We don't really need to search for partial parts of the URL if it's in HTTP. Here we can be very specific. So to use this, you would do something like tenant equals and then whatever the slug is that matches that config. This here, combined with the CLI resolver, will actually target these commands at the Dutch tenant or the Greek tenant, or, you know, you get the point. I just wanted to show you the default tenant function. It is very similar to the other two, but this just trades off of that default config parameter and throws a fit if we can't find the tenant. So if all of them have default equals false, then this exception will be thrown, because what config do we load, what views do we load? But you seldom get here. As long as you have one of them set to default, you shouldn't get to this error. Then Laravel has this really cool thing called a bootstrapper. It's a cool concept more than it is a particularly complex concept. It's basically just a class that has a method called bootstrap. It can be any class, it can extend anything, implement anything, whatever, it doesn't matter. But because it has this public bootstrap method, we can use it in an interesting way that I will show you. How Laravel uses that is it injects an instance of the app, so we can do things on the container like define something and give it a value, right? This is only one of the bootstrappers. You can infer what the CLI one would be like. You would probably use your tenant resolver and pass in a parameter that says resolve this for the CLI instead of HTTP, like I'm doing. You need to use your imagination a bit, but however you do this, whatever comes out of this short closure needs to be that tenant object, and then you can bind it to the container with singleton at that key. Now, once you make a bootstrapper, you can put it in the HTTP kernel or the console kernel. Laravel puts one of these in the app folder generally, and you can basically attach different functionality in the request response cycle by modifying this kernel. The kernels don't typically have this bootstrappers array by default, so you're going to have to go into the parent and copy that array out, and then you can put your resolver in this array of bootstrappers. Your bootstrap class in this array of bootstrappers. You probably want to put this a bit higher up, as long as you're not using any dependencies of any of the other bootstrappers that they load, because you will do this and you will resolve config to to tenant-specific values pretty early on, so that everything else, like your views and your database stuff, uses the tenant details instead of just the general application details. So try and put this as high up as you can. If you start getting errors, move it a little bit low down until it's happy. But this needs to go in your bootstrappers. Because it's in this array, Laravel will call this bootstrap method, and so you will have this bound in the container. I'm not going to show you the console version of this because time, for one, and for the second, the console version is like exactly the same kind of implementation. Once you get it for HTTP kernel, you'll get it for console, no problem. Okay, there are some cool helpers that we can add to work with this. If you've not defined helpers before, this talk is for you. Anywhere in your application, you can have a PHP file. So in the app folder, I have a helpers.php file. I define functions in there. We need to define functions wrapped in this function existing because the possibility exists that this file will get included multiple times in a request, and you can't redefine functions in the same request. So without extensions. So we wrap this tenant function within a check to make sure that it hasn't already been defined. Anyway, we get the resolved tenant out of the container. This is the flip side of that app singleton call. This says whatever you put in with that, take it out over here. If we are not defining a key, we just return the whole tenant object. But if we are defining a key, we get that value from the tenant. We could probably do this a little bit nicer with collections if we wanted to. I'm not super bothered with it. You can see how this works so far. Okay, to get those helpers to load, because they're not in a class, we can change compose.json's auto load lookup stuff. So this is the kind of stuff that you will usually see in a new Laravel application. We can define an extra array down here called files with a path relative to composer.json. And then once we run composer dump autoload, this you might have seen command before being run by Laravel, but once we run composer du or dump autoload, it will bring that helpers file into the autoloader, and you will be able to use those helper functions from anywhere in your code base that is being run through Composer. Okay, so helpful helper to do. If you haven't defined helpers before, welcome. This is how you add them in Composer, and remember, you need to dump the autoloader as well. Okay, more config things. So we've got sort of a base config here where we can define tenants. That's good, but we need to start doing useful things with that. What I would love in an ideal situation is to be able to have config files that are only loaded for a specific tenant. So this is an example. This is actually running in one of our apps. We've got our normal config files. They're actually nested in this config folder. It's difficult to tell because of all of this gubbins in the middle. But then we also want to have an overrides folder, and in there, particular overrides we can run per environment, overrides we can run per tenant, and overrides we can run per tenant per environment. You might not need this full system, but it's super useful to have anyway. So pick what you need, but we use all of these things in various ways in single applications. It's kind of useful to have. How do we get to this is the question. I'm sorry I couldn't break this code snippet up into smaller screens as hard as I tried because there's a lot of inter-referencing here, but we can define a new bootstrapper which resolves tenant configuration or loads it. It's a good idea to base this on Laravel's load configuration bootstrapper because there's built-in functionality we want to run. That happens a lot in parent bootstrap. So extend this class. Don't worry, no one's watching. We do, however, need to override this. So we can do that by resolving the tenant. After we've done all the parent stuff, we resolve the tenants to get a slug, and we use that to load configuration from different locations. So I've got this load tenant configuration thing. I want to focus first on these things over here. So set caching directory. Laravel uses some environment variables to figure out where it needs to save cache files. This is used a lot in platforms like Vapor, because where deployment is very automated, it's useful when stuff is cached for Laravel to say, okay, well, I want to cache this in a non-standard location, put it here. And so we can piggyback off this functionality by defining these things per tenant. We can say, okay, use the Bootstrap cache folder, but instead of just a routes.php, put the tenant name in here instead. Sorry, this fmt function is just a fancier sprintf that I've made. It's just doing string interpolation. So where it sees this, it's going to put this variable. Okay, so for the routes cache file, use a thing that says bootstrap cache tenant name, like NL, for example, routes.php, same with events, same with config. So when these things are cached, it's going to look for the tenant slug and it's going to cache them in files specific to that. Now that's super useful because your different tenants might, one of them might have a different route defined or different config files defined, and you don't want to be using a different tenant's config or routes in, you don't want to be using the Greek tenant routes and config in the Netherlands application, the Dutch application. Wow, I confuse location and language often in this talk, I apologize. So, okay, set caching directory. All this is to say, this is going to give us tenant-specific cache files. Then, load from cache. If we have, using this really helpful internal function of Laravel's, if we have a cache file for these things, just include those and override what is in config and basically exit. So if we have cached config, when we get to this point, we just want to return out. That's all that this is doing. Now say we don't have cached config. This might be in development, or the cache might just have been nuked in a deploy. Well, then we can determine what that cache is. We load in the different environment folder structures, as we see here. So overrides per environment, overrides per tenant, and overrides per tenant and environment. We bring in the config that's already been bootstrapped by Laravel, and we just go through the config, replacing different values. We do need to remember, though, to unset that config overrides. It's not necessary for that to be carried around for the rest of the application lifecycle, because by the time we get to this line here, the config is already overwritten for the current tenant. So we don't need access to this overrides. Anyway. Now, an example of how we can differ config is maybe per tenant we want to set things like time zone or application name or different AWS stuff. Well, this is a good example of one that we override for the whole tenant. But you can think of examples for things that we override per environment. Like, for instance, if you're running local and staging systems and you want the Laravel debug bar, well, then you'd put that config file in config overrides local and config override staging / debug bar, I think is the name of that config file, and you could configure those things in there. But you wouldn't want those loaded in production, so that wouldn't be something that you did in the production environment override of config. Similarly, if you wanted to do load SQLite in testing for Netherlands, but you wanted to do MySQL in production, well, then that would be an override per tenant per environment, and you could do that as well. So you can think of all sorts of reasons why having the flexibility to do this is really good. It also means that you need to rely less on the named environment variable files in the root of the project. So you don't necessarily then need a testing.env.testing or .env. whatever, right? Okay, next thing up is views. So this is probably the most powerful, apart from config, because that config stuff is really powerful in a multi-tenant app, but this is probably the next most powerful thing. It's really amazing how flexible Laravel is in this area, and this is the biggest argument for why you don't need an extra library or package for multi-tenancy in Laravel. Imagine we want to have a view structure resembling this. Now, this has a lot of stuff in it, maybe a lot more than what you need, but the important thing is this is our normal view stuff. We got a components folder, we got an includes folder, maybe your app doesn't have that, but most importantly we have a theme folder, and in here we want to have different folders for different tenants. This is from a different application, a different multi-tenant application that we've done. So it isn't NL or PT or GR, but these are tenant names from that application. And so it would be really useful if we could have in our views folder theme and then by tenant and then have views inside that. And what would be better is if these views would just automatically overwrite similarly named views in the rest of our views folder. And the purpose of that is we design a template for our tenants, and then we extend them with design or with specificity. So we make our generic header, but then one tenant will have a logo and one tenant will have just text as their company name in that. And so we want to override different components or views based on the tenant, but we don't necessarily want to have to hard code a path to the tenant's view. Well, Laravel's got us covered. We can make a service provider. This can just be a normal service provider. We don't need to put in any like built-in view service provider for this. In boot, we can use this thing called load views from. And what that does is it takes an array of paths and in order that they're defined, looks for the name of a view. So here we can say the first path you need to look in is views, theme, tenant name. And if you don't find it in that, just look in straight in views. It takes a second parameter, which is a namespace. And this is kind of important because if you don't define this, I think it's going to go straight for, I mean, firstly, I think this is a required parameter, but just define it, okay? Just define it. The way that you use this is just to have the name of that namespace with a double colon and then the path to the view. So you can use this in the view helper from your controllers. You can use it in @include and have that prefix there. So in this example, it's going to say, okay, I've got that theme namespace, so these are the list of paths I need to use, and I'm looking for contacts list. So first look in views theme Acme, the name of that tenant. Acme is an example here. This could be NL, this could be Nexajob, whatever the name of the slug of the tenant is. So views theme slug, and then contacts list. And if that exists, that's the view that will get run. If not, it'll fall back to views, contacts lists. And if it doesn't find this either, it's going to give you that view not found error that you've probably seen like a million times. This is really useful. Come to find, it works with components as well. The way that you define that's a little bit different. So again, in a service provider, and you can define these and the view ones as well. I'm just cutting it down to focus here. But you use this blade anonymous component path. You can define named components with namespaces. I'm not going to go into that right now, but this is the typical way that we would use components in our apps. So anonymous component path, defining firstly the theme path. Again, we have this namespace parameter, and then just the generic fallback path with the same namespace parameter. These are additive. So you would have seen the view one, you just override the views array. This is additive. So you have to use the theme here in order to get this one to load first. There's no like prepend anonymous component path is what I'm saying. But the way that you use this for components is prefix and then the component path. So this X layout, typically, if you don't have the prefix X layout as a blade component refers to views, components, layout, this bottom path here. Once you add the theme, it's going to look for those paths that it must load the anonymous components for. Because we said look in the theme one first, it's going to try and load that component. If it doesn't find it, it's going to fall back. If it doesn't find that, it's going to give you the same view not found or component not found error that you've probably seen a bunch as well. So, loading dynamic views and components. This is a killer feature of Laravel, and if you've not done multi-tenant stuff, you probably haven't had much call to use this, but it is super cool for this use case. Okay, Vite. How do we do theming in Vite? Short sidetrack. I like to use Laravel Herd. You may be familiar with Laravel, with Valet. Similar systems. Herd is actually built on top of Valet. But I say that because I like to use the SSL that Valet and Herd make really easy to use. Come to find, with recent Vite versions or recent Vite configurations with the Laravel plugin, this has not always been easy to achieve. I'm talking specifically about the dev Vite server running through SSL. So a way to get around that is a pattern that I've come to use is to say the host name specifically, and then reuse that in the URL, the app URL parameter. You can resolve other environment variables like this in these parameters, which is a really good thing to know about. Okay, so I split the host name out. I also installed .env, and then in Vite config, apart from the default config that you will recognize, most of this is built in when you make a new Laravel app. This is built in, most of this is built in, but what's new is that I load .env and path. I load that env file. This is the env file at the base of the application, and then I pull in this app hostname that's defined in .env, and I detect TLS from that. You have to use a domain name with this detect TLS parameter in the Laravel plugin in order to get Vite's dev server to automatically route through SSL. So this is a really good thing to know about. Now, it is a sidetrack, but we get to the tenant stuff almost immediately. You can also pull in a tenant environment variable. So this is potentially you're doing tenant equals NL, and that's one way to get this populated. But you could also in your .env have a default tenant defined there if you wanted to, tenant equals NL in your .env file. That would also get this populated. I'm being super cautious here. I have this in my env. Sometimes I put it in the command line, but I also have a fallback here because you don't want this thing to error out really in your build process. It's just a pain in the butt. So I put in a default tenant here. This could probably in some universe be pulled from the config file. I'm not going to go to that effort. So this is really useful because you have this build directory parameter in this Laravel plugin, and what this does is instead of building to the default public JS app.css and public JS app.js, it puts those files in a theme folder. This lets you build themes for different tenants in the same deployment. So you will have public/theme/nl and public/theme/gr in the same deployment, but you'll be able to compile different sets of CSS and JavaScript for them, which is essential for different tenants. Now, apart from having a build directory parameter in the Laravel plugin, the Vite directive that you would have seen from Laravel docs, or if you're using Vite already, you probably would have seen this just as the only parameter. Well, you can do a second parameter, which is the build folder to look in. So this lines up with this build folder, which means if you do this just on its own, it's not going to find that file. But if you do this, it's going to find the built version of this in this build folder, which is really cool for theming. Okay, what about different Tailwind configs? You don't necessarily want to run the same Tailwind configurations. Maybe different tenants or brands have different colors, different fonts, different spacing. You get the picture. In your Tailwind config, you can do something similar to getting reference to a tenant. But then you can just shortcut this process and say module export is whatever comes out of this config file using the tenant name. And that means you can define Tailwind config, tenant name JS, or tenant slug, JS, Tailwind config, a different tenant slug JS. You get the picture. So when you build with Vite, it's going to use this config, but it's going to load one of these based on the tenant that is being used. So if you say tenant equals NL, npm run build, it'll use the NL config, or it'll use whatever's the default, or you get the point, right? This is how you do different Tailwind styles in the same deployment for different tenants. Okay, we're almost done. Components, step 8. Now, this is a super sidetrack, but I've shown you how to load different components for different tenants based on that theme prefix. I want to talk a little bit about components if you haven't used them. So if you have, you'll know a lot of the stuff. Maybe you learn a thing or two, who knows. This is a component we like to make for our apps. It's a layout component. Most of it just looks like an HTML doc, but it loads things like the head meta stuff with style sheets and all the scripts and stuff at the bottom, and like some navigation stuff and footers and all that governs. The only interesting difference here is that we've got a slot variable that we're echoing out. If you make a component like this, then I'll show you how you reference this later, but this is basically all the content in a nested view that gets loaded in here, gets inlined in here. You can make components accept props as well. If you make class-based components, you don't use the syntax, it becomes class properties. I don't really want to go into that too much, but you can, if you make your layouter component in this example, and I highly recommend you make your layouts components, you can accept props, and then you can customize the behavior of the component based on what those props are. So this is me saying title is nullable. You could have a default value here, which is this config if you wanted to. You could have no arrow and value, and then this would be a required parameter by everyone who uses this component. There are a few different ways that you can do this. What you're looking for is a section in the docs called Laravel Blade Component Properties. Okay, there are other ways to customize this. What if we want to have a bunch of different HTML elements under this umbrella of meta, like OG stuff, or OG is one of them, the Twitter stuff, all kinds of things, right? RSS feed, links, whatever. Well, we can use it in a similar way. Here it's just echoing out. Similarly, we just echo this out. It comes to us as a string. So we define a prop up here, we echo it out. Pretty similar. Now, this is how all these different things get used. Where we defined title up here, if we give it as an attribute where we are loading this component, then this is what gets loaded into that $title. If we use this special slot format here, it's just x slot colon the name of the variable, well then this gets loaded into that $meta value. And everything that's not inside an x slot or inside an attribute, everything that's inside here, this is what gets put into that $slot variable. So these are three different ways to pass data to a component, and they all have their uses, right? This is if you just have like a little configuration thing, like a simple string or a class that you want to pass in, or a boolean to switch different functionality. An attribute works really well for that. If you've got multiple HTML elements, xslot works really well for that. And for everything else, in the most cases are simple cases, and you want to like nest a bunch of content, but it's not in a slot, well, it's just between the opening and the closing of this thing. That becomes $slot. This stuff does not get put into $slot, it gets taken out. All right, now the only other thing that I want to show about these components is, you'll see here I've got stack scripts. Sometimes you want to have these places that you just accept any kind of input in, and stacks are really useful for that. So in this example, I've got a stack here for scripts. What if I have different views that want to load in special Google Analytics code or widget code or JavaScript for a very page specific thing, but I want them to load in the same location? I can use the stack scripts. And the way that we do that is we push something onto the stack. So forget about this once for a second. We define our JavaScript, we push all this content onto the script stack, so it pushes basically everything between that. And when we load the stack in that layout component, it's got all this stuff in it, which is really useful. Particularly for scripts and styles, you might have multiple pages that load the same script. Say, for example, you're embedding a game and you've got this game engine JavaScript, but you only want to load that once in your whole application, no matter who needs it. You don't want to have that engine loaded multiple times, and you can use the once directive to make sure that whatever is in between here only gets done once. So Blade will actually make a hash of all of this content, and if it sees that hash again, it won't do it a second time. It's really useful for scripts particularly, but I just thought if you didn't know about it, now you know about it. Really useful. Okay, last thing I want to talk about mostly is context. So if you've been watching the news, you would have seen lately Laravel added a thing called context. Now this can be super useful for multi-tenancy. At Ringier we don't typically use it for this, but you can. And a way that it is super useful is that you can add something into context, like say the tenant, for example, and you can give it like a string, or you can give it the tenant object we define in config, however you want to do that. And somewhere else in the same request, you can do context get with whatever that key is, and you will get that value out. And it's not just in the request response cycle. If you spawn a queued job, if you spawn a command line in that request response cycle, the queued jobs, the command lines, they all get access to this context. Really powerful concept. Now you can utilize this for multi-tenancy, and the way that you do that would be, if you were, one way that you could do that is if you had a database and then you had like a field on everything in that database called tenant ID, and you wanted to make sure that when you save new records, you always save them with that tenant ID so that they are assigned to their specific tenant. Eloquent, which is the ORM in Laravel, has this booted function that you can override, and anything inside booted gets run on a model instance when it's created. So you can also use lifecycle hooks of that model. In this case, I'm saying when this model's booted, okay, add this hook. Now when this model is being saved, and I get an instance of that, just before it's committed to the database, set this value. And you can use your context value in here as well. That's a really cool way. So any page in my application now, just before it gets saved, I get that tenant ID out of context, I put it in that column, and now in my database, every page has a tenant ID, but I don't have to define that in my controllers usually, or my forms or whatever. I can just define that in kind of a global spot for this model. Super useful, right? What about when you're getting data out? What if you want to filter all data that comes out of the database based on the tenant that's there? Well, you can also use booted for that. There's another thing that you can make called a scope. Now there are different kinds of scopes in Eloquent. I'm just using a global scope for that. That means that every query that I do on this page class is going to have this scope applied to it. Every query. I have to use a function on the query to get it not to apply this scope. But usually with stuff like tenant filtering, you always wanted to apply that scope if you're sharing a database with tenants. So global scope is a good idea for this. You just give it any name. This is the name that you would use if you wanted to disable it in the query. I'm not even going to show you that code. But you get an instance of builder when you define a global scope, and you can say anything in that builder that will get applied to the query when the scope is applied to it. So here I'm saying whatever I query on pages, make sure that there is a where tenant equals ID applied to it. And that means I will only ever get pages for this tenant unless I explicitly disable the scope for this. Cool, hey? Now you can see why context is useful. We don't typically use context at Ringier, and I'll talk about a little bit about that in this section. So I've called this wisdom not because I'm super pompous, but because it's always good when you're making these apps to talk to people who have made apps of a similar size or for a similar market or in a similar tech stack. And we've done a lot of this. So here is what we have found making medium to large multi-tenant commerce applications across Africa and Europe. Here are some bits of wisdom. We recommend using a separate database per tenant. This is the main reason why we don't use context for multi-tenancy. We have used context in multi-tenant applications, not Laravel's new ships with Laravel version, but a very similar version, even in some of the code bases I've demonstrated from tonight, because it's pretty useful for things like SEO content that starts at a default point and changes through the request lifecycle until it gets put in the view. But we use separate databases per tenants for a number of reasons. Firstly, it is impossible to query data from a different tenant by accident. You have to do a lot of work to be able to query data from a different tenant if you use separate databases per tenants. That's a huge security win. If one database is breached, all your other tenants are still safe, assuming you don't use the same credentials or they're not stored in the same place or whatever. You get the idea. Separate database per tenant. Another really good compelling argument for this, I just thought I'd mention as well, is you can bill for databases separately. So databases on AWS tend to be on the more expensive side of the resources that you can get, and if you want to make sure that your big tenants are paying their fair share of the cost, you can bill databases separately if the databases are separate. But if everyone's data is in the same database, you can't really compare size or traffic without a lot of extra work. You can share caches though, because caches are dirt cheap and they're really simple to break down and spin up again. And you know what, if there's a problem with it, well, you could just rely on the database if you wanted to. You don't have to share caches, of course. If the security aspect of not being able to pull cache data from a different tenant appeals to you, by all means use separate caches as well. But if you're going to share a cache, use a cache prefix. You can use cache prefixes by changing config. You can do this now because you've got your tenant overrides and your environment overrides. So use a cache prefix if you're going to share cache. It's super useful. Avoid conditionals and templates. So a big temptation when you've got multiple tenants and they both want listen to me, you've got multiple tenants and different tenants want slight differences in their wording or placement or layout or whatever it is, right? Avoid as much as you can if statements in templates that switch things based on tenant config. This is an incredibly difficult problem to deal with when your code base grows and now you've got if statements for tenants everywhere and you've got to have redundant config in each tenant because you're depending on that value being there in config. It's a mess, right? Use the view overriding for themes that I showed you. Use the config overriding, use the component overriding. And if you are smart about this, you'll be able to completely override a page or a component just by defining it in the theme for that tenant instead of having conditional logic in the fallback views. Also use herd. If you're doing this on dev, use herd. It's so simple to set up. You can use, I don't think I have the examples of this here, but you can use the herd link function, valet link, for example. So you clone your repo, you go into that folder and you say herd link and then the tenant's dev domain. Herd link a different tenant's dev domain. Herd link a third tenant's dev domain. And then all of these refer to that same code base. And then you can go herd secure and you've got SSL on all of them. Like, it's so simple to set up and use. Much simpler than manually doing this in Homebrew or Docker. I understand why you might prefer those in terms of being able to install custom extensions, but actually Herd's come a long way with the extension side of things. So now it ships with popular extensions used by Laravel, including Xdebug. It's really easy to enable them. Marcel has told me he's got ideas for making this even simpler to do through the UI of Herd. It's really good. You can use the free version for everything I've shown you today, but you can also use the Pro version if you want to do things like have it manage MySQL or Redis or any of that stuff. It's actually really good, and I'm actually waiting with bated breath for my Pro license to come through. So yeah, use Herd. I think that's all I have to talk to you about. You can find these slides on assertchris.io. If you scroll down to the bottom, there is a section on slide decks. This might move around as I work more on this application, but for now you can find this deck down here. Yay, it's that one over there. And you can get all the way back to the website if you need to as well. Now that I've recorded this, I'm also going to be putting this recording up in the talk section. I might get a better version of this tonight when I present this to the meetup group, but come check back later because you might see a recording of it in here if you want to refresh your memory. There is an RSS feed on this app, so you can get to that from down here. Useful for keeping up to date when that talk gets published or when this gets updated or when any other cool stuff happens here. That's me.